So, today we're going to have a conversation with Wendy Newman, who's a senior fellow and lecturer at the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto and a good friend, a great contributor on a lot of new librarianship work. I'm going to ask her to give a little bit more of her background, but I think it's going to become clear very soon that she's done a lot of work around advocacy in libraries and librarians, particularly being an advocate for libraries and librarians. So, good day, Wendy. How are you?
Very well, thank you, and just delighted to join you.
Can you give me a little bit about your background? Let's let folks know where you're coming from.
Okay, I am a newly minted retiree, actually, which just means I'm still a librarian, still an advocate, still doing all this, but nobody pays me anymore, which is fine. Um, I've just retired from my position at the iSchool at the University of Toronto. Before that, I had a really long career in librarianship. I worked in every type of library. Started out in academic librarianship and thought I'd spend my life there. But as it turned out, public librarianship, to which I came in the last 20 years of my library administrative career, has been the heart of my home and the place where I felt that I could make the difference that I longed to make as a librarian. And in fact, what was remarkable about that is what I experienced of new librarianship in that administrative career without the vocabulary that is used in that mapping of librarianship. It's really about an outward focus in the community, one that seeks to make a difference for the whole community. And it's an outward focus that completely transcends planning and managing library operations, which is, I think, the business that I had thought it was many, many years before. So, for example, in my last administrative position as CEO in a city which was a Rust Belt city, extremely high unemployment and a really discouraged city, we all worked together to create a new campus of an existing university, and the library's role in it was to become the virtual university library core for that campus, which has since completely transcended its enrollment projections and has become a lively entity in a formerly kind of bombed out downtown. And, we know bombed out downtowns in North American cities. So that was a huge change. And we did that as a community by putting our strengths together rather than expecting them to come running with the money, there were, excuse me, there was none of that available. We had to do it ourselves. And I think that's the kind of thing that made me really excited as a librarian, and the kind of thing that I think makes librarianship essential to a healthy community that looks to itself and develops its strengths, and not to outsiders to create its future. I also served as a volunteer president of the Canadian Library Association. I am something of an association junkie. And before I was president of the Canadian Library Association, I was president of its public library division. So we did a lot of advocacy and media relations in those roles on subjects like intellectual freedom and broadband development in Canada. Huge country, huge challenges with broadband deployment. And I was one of a tiny handful of public sector people appointed to the National Broadband Task Force by the Government of Canada. Numerically, that task force was completely dominated by the presidents and CEOs of the telcos, the cable cos, the usual people. So I and others in that position had to learn to punch well above our weight, not by nagging, but by being highly strategic and by helping the task force to lay out a blueprint for broadband deployment that would convince the Government of Canada that this was in the public interest. In other words, that would yield taxpayers' dollars. So really, the nonprofits were in charge of establishing why it was in the public interest. So it was an exciting role, but it was not a group in which the question, what is a librarian doing around this table, was readily answered or answerable. I was also the head, as I mentioned, of a public library system in a really poor city, where the library had not been very well funded, and where its relevance in the overall scheme of the city was not necessarily readily apparent. So, I mean, these are the kinds of experiences that tell you that if you don't punch above your weight, if you're not highly strategic, that the things that you care about very deeply and that you think are important to the community are just not going to get the traction they need. So fortunately, I'd become a volunteer advocacy trainer for the Canadian Library Association in the Library Advocacy Now program, which had been very generously given to us by ALA to customize to Canadian circumstances. So I gave hundreds of workshops in this, and just and learned a lot more about practical advocacy settings. So when I retired, and I retired early, and I went back to my alma mater at University of Toronto to hang out with the next generation, really literally just to be there, not to work there. I was asked to develop an advocacy course as a result of a student petition when they learned about my background, and no graduate school of library science at that time was offering an advocacy course, notwithstanding growing recognition of its importance. And eventually, again, I seem to be traveling in your wake. I turned that into a MOOC that was offered a couple of times, and over 9,000 people have registered for that MOOC, and the archive is still available on the edX platform. So, and I was helped by 20 guest commentators who told stories and illustrated advocacy points, including you, and thank you. So, as I said, I've been following the concepts of new librarianship in my career ever since the white paper on the library as conversation that you and your colleagues developed for ALA. And as I said, it resonated with me so strongly because it mapped what I had experienced. And I just felt very strongly that I knew that to be true and real. And I had so wished that I'd had those concepts when I was trying to develop an RFP for an integrated library system that would do those things, that would pull in community knowledge and make that accessible in an integrated kind of way. Alas, I had to do the RFP without it, and got a traditional fine system as a result. So I happened to mention, when I had the blurb in my hand for the Atlas as a forthcoming publication, to the vice dean that this Atlas was coming out. And an hour later, she said, "I've just been in a meeting with the dean. He wants you to develop a course on these concepts for one of our new short workshop courses." So that course, which is very popular, is still offered. It's offered by Stephen Abram now. And I think one of the reasons it's so popular, and one of the reasons that the Atlas has been so important, is that we have this deep desire for deep conversations about librarianship. So, and why it matters, and what's transcendent about it in the midst of all these changes. So that's my career in a nutshell, and how it has intersected with new librarianship concepts. And of course, none of this takes root. None of it becomes real without the advocacy of a lot of people, including you. And in my study of advocacy and teaching of advocacy, and I've traveled in the wake of several scholars, including Ken Haycock, who has supervised doctoral dissertations on this, and who has followed the literature and integrated a lot from research on healthcare advocacy and environmental advocacy, because the study of library advocacy is actually very small. The research base is very small. We have to derive our principles from advocacy experience in other disciplines. It's really I really found that it's been about three things, and I'm happy to talk about, wherever you want this to go, about values, relationships, and stories or narratives. And I guess that's what my career, my thinking, my teaching, my writing have become these days.
So let's pick up on that. That's clearly someone who spent a bit of time thinking about these. When you say there are three main items, we need to pay attention to them. Let's start with values. When you say values, in terms of advocacy, is that the idea that we start from our values, that we are advocating for our values? Talk to me about that component. Well, let's walk through them.
In practical advocacy, I think two things. One of them is it's really critical to know what we value and to have frank conversations about it. Because if we don't, and this has been my experience year after year, we don't have enough fuel for the tough times. And practical advocacy in librarianship is, in the interest of full disclosure, mostly tough times. It's highly incremental. There are 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 2 steps back. It proceeds really iteratively. And if we are not strongly anchored and explicit about values, I think we are at risk of losing heart, and we are at risk of losing focus. There are things that are unique to librarianship in terms of the combination of values. We are similar to the YWCA, to which I also belong, but we are also distinct. We are similar to community centers. We have a lot in common with them, but we are distinct. And I think that's the roadmap. That is the transcendent part of it, that transcends technology, which we sometimes talk about as if that's what we are about. It is the part that helps us transcend the media narrative and the popular cultural narrative about librarianship, that it is essentially about, as my friend Ken Roberts puts it, the guardianship of a declining print culture. I mean, that is the way in which we are portrayed. So without being defensive, which I think is just a huge mistake, and I worry a lot about our, social media conversations in librarianship, because I think we're chippy and defensive when we should be exultant and clear about values. We need to be anchored to values that are transcendent and be really clear about their value and importance. Is that helpful?
I think it's very helpful. Particularly, there was interesting in the United States. There was an interesting sort of dust up about the Washington office putting out a briefing on how the incoming president and Congress, how libraries could help them forward on an agenda, and a lot of people called up the values conversation, which is,
yes,
it may make sense to support them where they support our values, but we need to start with the values and push back. And then it led into a discussion about really pragmatism. This was certainly not the first time this kind of press release has been put out. Every time there's a Congress and president, they put it out. It's just this one particularly seemed at odds with a lot of the values from the chippy and social media side. And the idea that we should advocate from our values and put those forward and talk sort of where the president or Congress could align to our values and missions and such. And I think that sometimes it's often presented as an either or, right? So if you're advocating to get resources for libraries, you either get along to go along or something to that effect. In other words, find out how you can couch it in serving their needs, etc., and be extraordinarily pragmatic and just get the money and then worry about what you do later. Money, resources, power. And then the other, it's like, no, we won't take their stinking money because of our values. And yet there's this middle ground that says, look, we need resources to further community goals. these are the values that we are working from and working to instill in those communities. And where they line up, we should look for resources, and where they contradict, we should seek to advocate on the other side of things. And so, I think that people either look at it as, well, either you're pragmatic and you don't have values, or you're very ethical and you don't get anything done. And you can do both. You can have your values and be pragmatic. Is that
exactly?
Okay.
And that debate has also played out in the UK. As well. I'm a member of ALA, and I followed that discussion quite with a great deal of interest. And as former association president, I have had those discussions, admittedly in less dramatic contexts, with some of my own members. And I think as librarians, we need to learn more about advocacy and the dynamics of advocacy to get out of the either or. One UK blogger who was responding to something in my MOOC actually practically awarded me the Sleeping with the Enemy award. These things are occasions for us to be able to talk about that. And I think one of the take-home points in librarianship is that we must not make our beds narrowly. That librarianship and the people who value librarianship constitute a big tent. And whenever we arbitrarily narrow the tent unnecessarily, we damage our cause. And we tend to be, I think, in librarianship, left of center. David Frum, a right-of-center Canadian frequently seen in the American media, is, I understand, a strong supporter of libraries and librarianship because, among other things, it goes to the conservative value of self-help. That's certainly what was on Andrew Carnegie's mind. This was not a bleeding heart liberal kind of guy. And there were communities that turned down Carnegie's offer of funds to build a library 100 years ago because they did not like the way he made his money. But I think we can say that the legacy of Carnegie libraries in North America and the UK has been a strong and a healthy one. So we got to be careful to extricate ourselves from the either or dilemmas, which I think we all feel internally quite strongly.
And it's interesting, so that when you prepare to be an advocate, when you prepare to go out and tell the story, and we'll get to the relationships and narratives, starting with values is important, because not everyone's going to universally agree on your methods. Not everyone's going to universally agree on what you're advocating for. And without these strong values around intellectual honesty and access and all these things that make, as you say, the sort of transcendent nature of libraries, you need that strength to deal with the fact that you're going to do this in public and that you're going to encounter resistance. And you need to be able to fall back on values to say, it is worth dealing with this resistance. It is okay if someone claims that I'm sleeping with the enemy, if I understand that, no, I'm not, and there are places I will not go to at the same, and so I think that's often underplayed in librarianship, is that we can be a tough crowd sometimes. And without a strong sense of your own purpose and values and mission, it can be discouraging.
Yes. And some of the most vilifying notes I've ever received when I did media interviews about children and the internet were from other librarians. Some of the best ones were too. But I think we're not going to do this with our dukes up.
Right.
And we have to do a lot more listening and rather less chanting.
So that leads then into I think your second key point you mentioned, which is relationships. So we've got our house in order. We understand, what we're doing this for and what we're out to get and such. And I'm going back to your original comments, can't do this alone. So it's going to necessitate the creation of relationships. Am I getting close there?
Indeed. And Ken Haycock, in his speeches, will say that he thinks advocacy is essentially about relationships. They certainly are. critical, because it is only, as a practical matter, it is only when we have developed a relationship that is characterized by both credibility and trust that people can listen to us. Otherwise, our points just become part of the noise that surrounds every decision maker, every influencer. The higher up in the hierarchy decision makers and influencers are, the more frequently they are hammered by causes all the time. And that is the noise of their environments. And we can't break through just by yelling louder. We can't break through just by having the perfect Zoom talking point, although, things like Zoom are very helpful because they kind of transcend the kind of the long argument. So we have to make relationship development, if we're going to be good advocates for librarians, we have to make relationship development a way of life, a way of working, not just within our workplaces, not just within our own circles. We have to come alongside many more people, including many more people who don't share all our assumptions. And I think this is of particular concern these days because of our greater and greater tendency for all of us to exist within silos of people who agree. And so we have to grow our circles and form new understandings through more focused and targeted attention to relationship development. So what do I mean by that? Because I think to many people, that just looks like a life of schmoozing all the time. I mean, and this is one of the things that as an administrator, frankly, true confession, I wish I had paid more attention to staff perceptions of what I was doing particularly out there, because I think a chief librarian and any library manager has to spend at least 50% of their time in the community. And I think if you're not clear about that, if we don't have a shared perspective about that within an institution, I think that just looks like schmoozing for free drinks. So, but it has to be quite targeted and quite disciplined. So in our communities, whether they are cities, towns, villages, universities, colleges, law firms, all kinds of communities in which, and in communities in which we are not called librarians in position titles, but in which we practice librarianship at a professional level, we have to be at the table of our communities. We have to position ourselves there. We have to be active conversationalists in the identification of the issues of the community and the formulation of possible solutions and partnerships to address issues. And we have to speak up in those contexts as voices for the community, not voices for the library. We are voices from the library, but our advocacy has to be for the entity itself, for the community itself, for the firm, for the business, for the university, for the well-being of the students and faculty and so on. Because people don't do things for our reasons. They do things for their reasons. And at the table, our voices are for the big reasons. And we bring those values and we bring that deep knowledge of librarianship. We bring the capacity of libraries and librarians. But we are at the big table developing relationships and understandings so that people understand, contrary to the popular cultural associations with what we are and do, what we really are. I mean, there is a librarian on I live in the city of Hamilton, which has huge issues in poverty. We have a round table on poverty reduction, and every major organization in this community is there, including the library, because it's critical that decision makers in our community understand how important librarianship is as a poverty amelioration strategy, And matter of fact, it's one of the few things that actually work. So when we are at the table, we develop relationships and understandings. And in the wake of those relationships and understandings, we can be heard in a way that we can't be heard when we're reciting talking points in some kind of competitive environment. So that's really important. And of course, what we bring to those conversations are narratives and stories. And that is where, when we do that, then the real power and impact of what we are and do is so much more readily understood. And it is understood not in terms of the self-interest of the library as institution or as librarians who would like to remain employed. I mean, I am all for enlightened self-interest, of course. You don't work for free. I didn't used to work for free. But the voice of self-interest is not a credible voice. And it does not come across as the voice of a community. It comes across as the voice of a lobbyist in the worst sense of lobbyist.
So you talked about that. So we get our house in order. We understand what our values are. We build relationships for those who can help us further those values, get us the resources we need, get us the support, etc. And I very much love this phrase that we're voices from the library, but voices for the community. And one of the things that I really learned a lot from you, and I think it's just a brilliant way of articulating it, which is that voice, what we're sharing, is through the form of the narrative, is the form of the story. Which you can't just throw a bunch of statistics and assume the conclusion and how all those add up is self-evident. You can't simply say we're for access, so therefore give us money. That you really do need to ground it in a story that not only people understand, but can participate into and identify with. Is that fair? Talk about narratives.
And can value. The power of narrative is amazing. I mean, we know this. All cultures have stories, have big stories. And in every setting, stories have power. They move us, they change us. And of course, as I've said earlier, we have big challenges in librarianship because for many people, our story is about loan transactions and reference questions and, and this the guardianship of print culture and so on. But the business we're really in is individual and community transformation, as we know. And this is life-saving and life-changing stuff. It is capacity-creating stuff in individuals, in communities. So it matters. And I think we are quite understated. I think we are counter-strategically understated about how we communicate this traditionally. But if you take, for example, the Ferguson story that is so prominent and so wonderfully told in the field guide, we all know what happened. We know that the library stayed open, made a statement, made a difference. But I think the real power of that library is that it challenged and changed the narrative about the community itself. The narrative, the media narrative, and what had undoubtedly become, in many ways, the community's own narrative is, this is now a dangerous place. We have to be afraid of one another, and we have to stay inside because we're in danger. But the librarians' actions said, no, we're a community. We have created public institutions that matter, and public institutions where we belong. And this is a community that lives and breathes and cares and shares, and we look after one another. We have common ground. And that change in the narrative is a really transformative thing. When your community has become a public pariah and your local librarians just switch the channel, that's a pretty profound difference. And yet, as we know, That's librarianship 101. Yes, it's heroic, and yes, it's wonderful, but it's also it's librarianship 101. And that's a dramatic narrative that had a lot of media focus. But here's a little tiny story I used to tell my students, and I'm sure they were sitting there thinking, my God, how old is she anyway? But at one time, I attended a one-room school on a country road, and it was visited by a bookmobile. I am old enough that in my elementary school days, all education was textbook centered. And there were no supplementary texts. There was the textbook. And of course, we had books at home, but my parents chose those books. But when this little bookmobile that I thought was huge, it was probably tiny, the stock was probably pathetic, but I thought it was fabulous. The librarians that put that together, they combined, the access, the knowledge, the environment, the motivation, and that little girl went in and chose what she was going to read. She had the power to choose to go anywhere in her mind, ideas and places and stories. And so I went from a little girl in a small world to a little girl in a big world. That changed my life. It took me many years to understand that. And I'm 70 years old and I am still that little girl. That access, knowledge, environment, motivation is transformative for the person. And those librarians didn't know that. They just had to believe it. And that was a traditional service. I mean, there's nothing more traditional than bookmobile that goes to a school. So we have to engage as advocates. We have to engage alliances and other advocates because we're too small. And what we do is culturally not well enough understood. It's experienced by a lot of people. But we have to be intentional about creating platforms and strategies and to grow our advocacy by forming these relationships and by identifying and telling stories so that our stories are well matched with the people in whom we have now developed relationships. The story has to resonate with that decision maker or influencer, and not every story does. But I mean, if at the University of Toronto, which is it's 65,000 students and counting, students go there from all over the world, freshman students. I mean, how big and important do you feel as one student in a university of 65,000 people that has this giant humanities and social sciences library, Robarts Library? Those librarians developed a system in which every student has a designated, named personal librarian, and that's what they call it. So what's the impact of students' understanding of and interaction with that person on their ability to hang in there through a lonely and frightened first semester? And okay, what does that story, the impact of that story, mean to a university administrator who may not go all fuzzy-wuzzy about the relationship, but who has a mandate and a whole lot of financial and other accountability around student retention? So that administrator is likely to care about student retention. So that's the story, that's the work, that's the mission that person needs to hear about once that relationship is developed, once that credibility is there. That becomes a strategy that's key to the university. And if we are not intentional about packaging our stories and paying attention to our narratives and sharing them, then most of our advocacy will just sound like the same old, self-interested talking points that sound like the adults in Peanuts. We just sound like, oh, whoa, whoa, instead of somebody who's critically important to the future of this entity. So to do that, we have to know what our stories are, and we have to be out there listening, not just creating the relationships with the great and powerful, but practicing librarianship as a listening professional, and practicing librarianship in terms of being attuned to the aspirations of people. And that's how we know what the transformations are. And the research tells us that people who support libraries have that in common. They're actually not members. They don't hang out in libraries. The research tells us that they will support libraries every time and go to the mat every time because they believe libraries are transformative. So if we have to keep such people supplied with the stories, and we will learn the stories by hearing and listening, and by listening to people's aspirations and understanding what our impacts really are. And they're quite different from our statistics. So of course you have to have statistics. You got to have numbers, because for the municipal treasurer, he's in the business of the story of statistics. That is his story or her story.
Data is a storytelling mechanism of itself. I'm reminded of our colleague and good friend Kim Silk, who talks about the fact that, you need stories to make data matter, and you need data to make stories real. And putting them, but it really is still, they're both different forms of storytelling, just ways of supporting that evidence. I'm also struck by the idea of controlling the narrative, in the sense that if it's not, people will create a narrative regardless of whether you're involved or not. And you'd mentioned the UK example as sort of the keepers of a dying print world. And John Palfrey, in his book on bibliotech, talks about the dangers of nostalgia, which is sort of outdated stories. I mean, there's on one hand, you can see your story about the bookmobile very compelling because it makes it personal. Yes. You connect, you see it, it's important. But unless you continue that narrative, and then that set me up for a larger world, and then that larger world changes and I'm part of it, if we leave with a narrative of, libraries are nice and they make us feel warm and they're all about books, or they were great for a bygone era, that's a narrative that's out there. If we don't control and craft it, or at least begin to influence it, we can actually suffer from sort of these other narratives, whether they're antithetical, whether they're out of date, what have you. So and I like your point about being in the community and listening, because that narrative can be the large scale, which we see in the UK, that is, save our libraries because reading from books is still important, versus save our libraries because they'll always be relevant to learn.
Yes.
But it's also can be something like, boy, I'm paying a lot of taxes this year and the water bill's getting higher, and now the library wants money. To I just saw an article, younger scholars are not using the library anymore. And unless we are attuned to these stories, we can say, well, wait a minute, surely they are, and this is how we play them and such. And so storytelling is, I'm trying to do a summary because it's great stuff. It's a product of active listening. You got to begin by, what are the concerns, what are the narratives that are already out there, what is developing, and then proactively working with our partners to get out the narratives that move us towards our values and where we want to be.
Yes, and that associate librarianship with the future. Because I agree completely, reliance on nostalgia is extremely dangerous. I mean, it can be completely counter-strategic. It can play to certain types of decision-making audiences, but never just by itself. And if you don't have a compelling picture of where this is going, your advocacy won't so much, but Monty Python said, won't so much fly as plummet. Yeah. And so really, yes, we have to be doing what the Ferguson librarians do. We have to be at those tables. We have to talk in terms of the future and goals and aspirations, and not just about where we have come from. Because if you're not seen as part of the future, you've positioned yourself in a pretty vulnerable place.
So are there some general steps or guidelines if you're putting together an advocacy plan or a campaign that you might have folks think about? I mean, first of all, I will make sure we point folks to the MOOC, which is an amazing and brilliant resource where you can spend a lot more time than this. Consider this just a brief highlight of that. But give us a little bit of, when you're putting something together, how do you take values, relationships, narratives? How do you begin to think about that around an outcome?
It's very important to have a statement of your desired outcome, so that you, for example, so that you have mapped the territory, so that you know who are the decision makers and influencers in relation to that. I mean, so for example, step one is to disabuse yourself of the notion that there is any such thing as, quote, the general public. No advertiser does that. No politician running for election does that. You have to think in terms of niche and in terms of whose decision making is essential to move this forward. And what values, accountability, commitments, priorities does that person or group have? What kind of people and what specific people influence or inform this person if that person or group is distant from you? Who are our potential allies and how shall we engage them practically? So be specific about goals and planful about an approach. If you don't have relationships in place, start there. Rather than trying to drop leaflets from low-flying planes about what you want people to decide, work on relationships first. Build alliances, because these are the people who will speak for you when you're not in the room. So in librarianship, our voice is too small. So we are, for example, in intellectual freedom campaigns, we are allied with civil liberties people. We don't necessarily agree with every civil liberties person about everything, but we can be bedfellows on an issue. So, so who do we trust and who do we already know to be our allies? Have data and stories ready that address the priorities of the people we seek to engage as other advocates or the people we seek to convince as decision makers. You keep going back to that. People do things for their reasons, not our reasons. And understanding their reasons, understanding their context, their limitations, their timing. I think many of the advocacy campaigns I have worked on ran aground on timing issues. For example, in the 4-year, you have a 4-year presidential cycle. We tend to have 4-year national government cycle. In the first year of a government's mandate, there's one kind of environment. The second year, a different kind of environment. They'll do their cutting back in the first couple of years. And then the purse strings are loosened toward the end and in a campaign year. So if you don't understand the government's budget cycles and you're looking for money, you're going to miss, even if you get other things right. So it's knowing everything you need to know about your decision-making environment that will really help you. And the other thing is, in an environment that's characterized by a huge amount of noise and in which we have a huge amount of knowledge and evidence, simplify, simplify, simplify. No? Why should this matter? Those are some, you can take a whole course in this, and there are a lot of readings listed in the archive of the MOOC. and there is a whole advocacy planning rubric that you can use. But I think those are among the most important messages I could impart to anyone wishing to be more intentional and efficient about advocacy.
Well, that's amazing. Wendy Newman, my personal hero of advocacy and my mentor in the field. I really appreciate the time you've taken and what you have to share. And I, once again, really do recommend people go take a look at the MOOC. And I'm so glad that you are volunteering your time back to the profession. So thank you very much for your time today.
It's been my pleasure.